Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Dan Borshak, coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people. Coming up, living beyond our means, the controversial tax proposals to get a ballooning budget into balance. Classroom crisis, how Britain's behaviour czar would fix Australia's unruly schools. And breaking news, how kids tune into what's going on and why parents hold the key. Joining me on the panel, Santa Savina College Principal Paulina Skemman. Welcome back to the show.
Lovely to be here.
Chief Reporter of the Sydney Morning Herald, Jordan Baker. Great to have you along.
Hi, lovely to be here.
Former Liberal City of Sydney Councillor Catherine Grainer. Hey there.
How are you, Dan?
Good, thank you. Great to have you here. And CEO of the Australian Hairdresser Council, Sandy Chong. Thanks for joining us as well. And you can join us online using the hashtag The Drum, and we live stream on Facebook as well. First tonight, a new warning on how increasingly unsustainable the national accounts are, and a series of proposals likely to scare off politicians and perhaps voters. A wide-ranging OECD survey out today encourages the federal government to slug wealthy Australians with higher taxes to help pay for budget big-ticket items such as aged care and the clean energy transition. It recommends raising and broadening the GST, removing some tax breaks on superannuation and consideration of death or inheritance taxes. And it wants the government to rein in spending, particularly in disability support. The Drum's David Taylor has more.
Well, the OECD has penned some ideas about how to both reduce wealth inequality in Australia and whip the economy into shape. But they'll take some political bravery, like the idea to raise and broaden the GST, which it says would reduce the tax burden on both business and workers. And it says those who can pay more should, suggesting cutting tax breaks for those with large superannuation balances, a move the Treasurer initiated in February this year. And there were other controversial ideas, like introducing an inheritance and estate tax, raising the retirement age to 70, replacing state transfer duties with land taxes, and reviving a mining super profits tax, which was repealed in 2014. The OECD is also calling for more government spending restraint, and it's targeting the National Disability Insurance Scheme. The OECD calls for tangible measures to slow growth in the costs of the NDIS. An agreement struck this year by the National Cabinet aims to reduce spending growth from its current 14% to 8% by 2026-27. The bottom line is that older, wealthier Australians, according to the OECD, aren't taxed enough, and the bills for healthcare and the clean energy transition are only getting bigger, and they need to be funded.
David Taylor reporting there, and Greg Jericho is Chief Economist at the Australian Institute and joins us now from Canberra. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Dan.
Greg, this OECD report sounds like a bit of a wish list or a grab bag from some sort of progressive think tank, perhaps one like yours. But is it actually politically impossible the way they've framed it?
Look, Dan, I've been covering OECD tax reports on Australia for around a decade now, and I've got to say, they excel at coming up with ideas that no government wants to touch with a 20-foot barge pole. And to be honest, they always include, let's increase GST, let's broaden GST. They always include talk about land taxes and things that governments really don't want to attack. Now, that doesn't mean they're not worth doing, but there is always that case of whenever you write about these things, you always go politically tough choices foisted on the government by the OECD.
Yeah, which is always going to cut through or not, as it turns out. Greg, in that list, is there anything that you think would gain political traction and perhaps even more importantly, support within the Australian community?
Well, bizarrely, despite it being often blamed by the Labor Party for nearly killing their election hopes back in 2010, Australians are always pretty, actually quite positive about taxes and super taxes or windfall profit taxes on mining companies, especially most recently when associated with gas companies, which we know have just made billions of dollars pretty much off the back of Vladimir Putin deciding to invade Ukraine. They weren't doing anything else to try and raise gas prices. That did it, and they made absolute squillions. And really, if we had had a windfall profits tax on that, I think most people would have actually thought that's kind of a fair thing. Things like the GST, they are tougher. I certainly am not in favour of putting a GST on food, but I think if you are going to look at broadening it, things like private education, private health insurance, they could be things that are covered, but really tough to do with GST. And then when you get into estate taxes, which I personally am in favour of, you're always going to bump up against that death tax scare campaign, which is really tough for any government to overcome. And I can't see the Labor Party, certainly at this point, engaging in such a fight.
Jordan, I want to bring you in here because it struck me that some of these proposed reforms might be particularly more attractive to younger Australians or younger voters, and Greg kind of was starting to go there around perhaps super taxes, carbon and mining taxes, perhaps even that inheritance tax. What have you made of this call? Is it just a repeat of what we've seen in the past?
A lot of these things that are being suggested by the OECD have been tried and have not gotten over the line because there just wasn't the support. There was not bipartisan support. Dominic Perrottet tried to do land taxes in New South Wales. That fell on its head at the last election. That was rejected. We've tried the mining tax. 2019, we tried negative gearing. And a lot of these taxes, stage 3 tax cuts, they all benefit older people. But because in the current political climate, it is almost impossible to get any of these things over the line because the electorate is too terrified, because there just isn't bipartisan support for these big reforms. They're all going into the too hard basket. The too hard basket is piling up. It will be, the results of this will be borne by young people, because they are taxes that benefit older people. And we have a context now in which young people are bearing so much. You know, everything is just being left for someone else to deal with. And it is piling up and it's piling up, and it's really unfair on them. One thing I would love the government to try, though, just to see the fireworks involved, would be to tax the private school, GST on private school fees. Because
well, I'm going to have to give you a response to that one.
I'm not saying I'd love it to happen, but the political explosion would just be fascinating.
Well, firstly, not all private schools are extremely wealthy. We have a range of private schools. And also, private schools actually reduce the amount of money that governments need to spend on schools. And in fact, I have some great little figures for you. 228,000 children are in independent schools. If we took away the fees that they paid, that would cost an extra $2.2 billion in wages if it all went to the state, and $38 billion in extra facilities that the government would have to find. So, in fact, there is a significant burden lifted from the taxpayer because parents pay private school fees.
To this end, isn't the question or the challenge always subsidies for private schools? That's what always comes up in this frame, isn't it?
Look, a child costs $16,000 to fund in a state school. Our parents are audited on a capacity to pay. We get, less than half of that per child. Our fees then have to pay the gap, and then we have to maintain our buildings. Some of us have inherited very old buildings that cost a lot of money. We have to do that all on our own. So we actually help the government as far as the money goes, and it's this same thing that we hear over and over again, that private schools are costing money when actually we're reducing the burden on the taxpayer.
Greg, is that how you see it, as a reduction of that burden on the taxpayer?
No, not exactly. I'd argue that actually, sure, there is a place for private education, but I think what we've seen over the last 20 years is in a sense, a public funding of private education in a way that it was never intended to be. And what has been the cost of that is actually we're seeing this reduction in spending on public schools in a way that is framed as being a burden, that somehow we're reducing the burden on the public budget and public balance sheet. Really, I think what we should be thinking about, and this is one of the things about the OECD report, is I think it's framed a little bit too much as in, are we living beyond our means, rather than actually asking ourselves, well, what do we want as a society? What do Australians really want in terms of services, in terms of infrastructure, and thinking, okay, well, that's what society wants. That's the society we want to live in. how can we best and most fairly fund that, rather than thinking, oh no, people were sick or the NDIS is blowing out in budget, so we got to think about reducing our spending there, or maybe thinking about, oh, we need to perhaps increase the GST, rather than thinking about, okay, what do we really want our society to look like? And I think that's something that we're not really facing up to as much in this country. It's more about, oh, keep taxes low, and then not thinking, well, what happens on the other side of the ledger when you always are talking about tax cuts and not increasing the burden? What's the end result of that? It can often be a much less fair society.
Catherine, I'm keen to get your observations on this report, but also the political dimensions of this, because John Howard went to an election with that initial GST proposal and won only just. It seems like a different time, doesn't it? Could you imagine a politician, the Prime Minister, the opposition leader, going to an election saying, we want to broaden GST now?
Well, I think you can. Because I think there's probably time to review the GST argument. But when I read this report this morning, I checked the date. This report looks like it's been written in the 1950s. It's so old-fashioned. It absolutely has no understanding of what's happening in society. If we were in a public forum, I would say, hands up all of you who are over 65. And I'm often the only one in the room, girl, so it's all right. So hands up. And all of your viewers tonight, put your hands up if you're over 65. There are more of us than there are of you. So the ageing population is where, that's the reality of Australia. So if you go after my superannuation, or you impose death duties on my children when I die, let me tell you, this will be the shortest government in the history of Australia.
So is what you're saying that this is a report that is aimed at younger people and ignoring older Australians?
No, but I think Greg's probably, on the money. We do have to look at the GST. We do have to look at we missed the boat on sovereign wealth funds. I mean, to our absolute chagrin and I think shame. So we missed that whole understanding of those resources that could have actually provided a part of a balance, part of the change in the language, part of the change in the way we think about our finances. So, for example, the NDIS, which I know a lot about, and because I chair a disability services program, if you actually change the focus of the NDIS and said, we will put enormous amount of resources into early childhood services until the child is 10. You then have a child with good grounding, as it would be for any child in any school. You then have the grounding for a child becoming a very worthwhile, fulfilling adult. Going back to the ageing population, at 50, and one day you'll know what happens, that at 50 you will get a little letter from the government and it's your poo test. I'd like the government, and that's a great idea, but I'd like the government to send you a little envelope that says, you're 50, you have another 25 years of working if you so choose to do. What skills do you need for that job to keep going? Now, there are many people who won't, for a whole lot of reasons, won't be able to work, but there are a lot of women of my generation who came into the workforce later after child-rearing duties. And here's an opportunity for them to top up their superannuation. And there's a whole argument there about the imbalance for women and superannuation. So for me, this report it's not contemporary at all. And it hasn't worked out that we actually can have more people as taxpayers, but it isn't going to be the young. And Japan has already been down this road. They don't have enough young people in the workforce to pay for the services for their elderly Japanese. So we know what the future looks like unless we think differently.
Sandy, I saw you nodding away. Did you want to jump in? What was your view on this part of the chat?
Yeah, look, should I say that I'm over 65? So I can actually resonate with everything that you've been talking about. And I know that when I look at my career, I have worked really hard. And it's to, I guess, provide for my daughter. Okay, so the last thing that I want is to see any of that taken away when it comes to tax, etc. The interesting thing is exactly as you say, when we look at an ageing population, there's a really high percentage of those in business are actually the aging population. Very few of our younger population are going into business. They quite simply can't afford to. And I was at a roundtable yesterday, and it was really interesting because they were saying, you know, if you wanted to sell your business now, it's really difficult because young people don't have the resources, the money to buy a business. And so we do have an aging population that I think needs to be considered. When we look at, in my industry, for instance, in hairdressing, what is quite alarming is 70% of the industry is actually now sole traders. Okay, so it's almost like they don't buy business, but they're going to put their foot in the water and just try it out. But the problem with that, of course, is they could be turning over under 75,000, you know, not paying GST at all. And, you know, when we look at our industry at 70%, that's really high. But, you know, when you talk about broadening GST, I think as a ex-business owner, last time I was on, I said I sold my business after 39 years. And, you know, when I think about GST, I remember when GST came out that payroll tax was going to go. The problem is, of course, none of the states could afford that, so we kept the payroll tax. I've always been very anti-payroll tax. I know the states need it. But it's a disincentive to employ. And I think that when we look at any, when we look at our economy, we look at any solution, you know, small business really makes a big difference to our country. And, you know, I guess I'm an advocate to just make it easier, you know, make GST easier. Most small businesses really struggle with their cash flow, and they really struggle at paying their backs. And so, you know, if we're going to broaden GST, well, then where exactly is that going to go? Is it going to go on leasing? Because if it's going to go on leasing, well, then you're going to put a lot of people out of business as well. So I think that, look, there's some good points here, but I am from that older generation where I certainly want to protect my assets and I want to protect my super. And I also feel I've worked really hard, you know, for the benefit of my family. And I certainly don't want that taken away.
Greg, there was an Australia Institute Revenue Conference today. What were some of the ideas that were put forward there?
Well, some of the ones were, as I've stated, to really change our thinking and think about the terms of what types of society we want. But of course, when we're talking about revenue, the super big elephant, the $320 billion in 10 years elephant, is the stage 3 tax cuts. When they come into effect next July, they're going to cost in the first year about $21 billion, which is about how much the government's going to spend on the disability support pension. It's more than it spends on PBS, a heck of a lot more than it spends on private and public schools. So, and most of the benefit is going to wealthy, rich people who actually don't need it. And actually, if you look at the polls, don't even really want it. They'd much prefer that money to be used to spend on things, on infrastructure, on things trying to get us closer to a net zero. So, you know, all these things about GST, I agree. I don't think they're going to happen. No government's going to do it. But the stage 3 tax cut is this very poorly designed tax. It really doesn't do what it was supposed to do. It's pretty much just giving high income people a massive tax cut, not going to actually improve society. So really, if the government is looking for something to do, obviously don't get rid of it completely. That's probably politically untenable, but you can really change it, play around with it, deliver better tax cuts to those on low and middle income earners who've been smashed by cost of living rises, but also save money that either can pay down debt or actually provide services that really are crying out for support. And I think that's really where we should be fighting rather than all this sort of stuff that's obviously not going to happen. GST, estate taxes, wonderful. We could all put them on our wish list if we so desire. But the stage 3 fight is still there to be fought, and that's certainly where we saw a lot of discussion at the Australian Institute's Revenue Summit today, as well as sort of broader wealth tax things.
The stage 3 is so politically fraught, though, isn't it? Like, it was a big issue at the last election. It had already been brought in and passed by the government of the day. And then seemingly, so not to have a fight over tax, the then opposition, now government, said, no, we're not going to touch it. That makes it really difficult for them, because if they do look to tweak it, they'll be accused of reneging on an election commitment, won't they?
Well, I mean, yes, but the thing is, we did a recent poll, and actually it's not popular. More people would rather the government dump the stage 3 tax than actually keep it. But more people than either of that actually don't even know about it. They don't understand about it. I've sort of compared it to all that talk that we had for a few years about the Gonski reforms to education. People had no idea what the heck it was. And I'm not saying they shouldn't dump the stage 3. What the government should do is actually deliver a better stage 3, a stage 3 that actually could give about 80% of voters a bigger tax cut and actually costs less than the stage 3, because the stage 3 is incredibly expensive, poorly targeted. They could actually say, yeah, we're delivering the stage 3, we're delivering one though that is better. And if they were really smart, they could actually wedge Peter Dutton quite badly on this. But it does take a bit of ambition, and I have to say I haven't seen that yet, but certainly I'm going to, in the Australia Institute, we're certainly still pushing for it.
Well, we are going to see an election in the next couple of years, so it'll be interesting to see if that's a focus. Greg Jericho is the Chief Economist at the Australia Institute. Thanks for your company tonight.
No worries. Thank you, Dan.
Well, the relentless news cycle can be confusing and distressing for many of us, but especially for children. A new survey of Aussie kids aged 8 to 16 reveals most want to engage with what's going on in the world, but how they do, it may surprise you. Social media naturally is a big news source, especially YouTube and TikTok, ahead of Facebook and Instagram. But the most important voice and the most trusted is family, along with friends and teachers. TV ratings are ahead of social media and other sources. The report highlights low levels of media literacy, difficulties identifying misinformation, with kids reporting not enough news is tailored to them. The ABC's Behind the News has been doing exactly that for more than 50 years, and this week they asked some of their audience how they engage with news.
I get my news from the TV.
Either my parents, my friends, the radio or BTN when we watch it in the classroom.
I feel like there's not enough channels to break down the complex stuff and understand it to younger people.
Adult news is sometimes a little bit too complicated and a little bit too hard to understand. There's also some inappropriate things, but if we have more kid news shows, it would be a lot easier to understand.
Usually makes me pretty sad to see what's actually going on in the world.
I would love to see more positive stuff instead of more negative stuff.
I do feel like it's important so younger people actually know what's going on, because we're not always told everything that's happening. So I feel like it's good that BTN can do a news program for younger people.
Behind the News there, which was appointment viewing for me when I was at school. Paulina, is it still the case now? Is this still a must-watch for kids?
The little ones, absolutely is. Yeah, absolutely.
Why do you think it's resonated?
BTN. I think it's because it is child-friendly and the language is child-friendly and they do break it down. I think a lot of our kids can be overwhelmed by what they see on the television news. I think if you switch it on at the moment, you'd be almost sending your children to the other room.
Interesting comment about the child who wanted it to be positive. She got positive news.
And we don't.
BTN.
That's not the news really, if it's positive. But and then the accidental news that they're picking up on social media, so they're flicking through. And many of our schools were alerted in the last 2 weeks to be very mindful and to let our parents know that children on TikTok might be seeing very confronting scenes in the Middle East.
And is part of the answer then, if young people are saying, look, we want positive news, is it actually looking at news from a different angle and saying positive might not necessarily be rainbows and skittles, but it might be explaining this is what you might be seeing happening in the Middle East right now. This is perhaps what it is about underneath that. Here's all the kind of issues. Is that part of it?
I think so, but an 8-year-old couldn't process that. But certainly when you're getting to the age of, 13 and above, absolutely, understanding the rationale, what's happened, the story, and that is the job of schools and teachers, and we do it all the time.
Jordan, you've got 2 kids under 10. You're consumed in news all day, much like I am. How have you introduced media to them?
Look, I'm a special case. I get my children to read Sydney Morning Herald stories in the paper and on the website. I talk to them about current affairs a lot. they are interested, because I talk to them about the sort of stories I'm writing, and, you know, I'm writing the story about this and this person said that and that person said that. What do you think? And we have these discussions, and I leave books around about political systems and economic systems, and I'm a terrible nerd. But
So the OECD report earlier is going to be on the coffee table.
Breakfast reading tomorrow morning. But I think for me, I know, the poor things. For me, though, I think the parental role is really important in interpreting news, explaining news, encourage critical thinking in kids. What my concern is, though, is that I think a lot of adults are media illiterate.
I agree.
And I think that is a problem. Like, I've had many cases where people have confused, and this happened a fair bit in education, I've got to say, where people confused me quoting someone in a story for it being my view.
Yeah.
And they didn't understand that the role of the journalist is to say, you know, this person says this about this, and this is what the statistics are, and this person said something different. If I wrote about a single-sex school, for example, they would say, oh, well, Jordan Baker's against single-sex schools. I didn't understand that my role as a journalist was to present different arguments on an issue. So I think just at a very basic level, even a lot of adults don't understand, a lot of educated adults don't understand, and so many parents don't really understand how the media works.
But I think I don't know that we're always getting, sorry to say this on the ABC, but I don't think you're balanced, I'm sure. But I think there are...
Well, I strive for impartiality.
I think that we are sold the news as truth, and it's not truth. So the whole fake news, a lot of the stuff that we see that's not...
When you say it's not true, you mean because it's a range of perspectives?
It's an alternative reality, you know.
Or different people's views.
It's views, it's not facts. It's not he said, she said. It's I think, I believe, so therefore it's true. I think the telling of news has changed over time.
Is this also about the blurring of news and opinion?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I feel this, and as a news presenter, so it must be the truth. It's very different to what you're saying. When I grew up, you learnt to read a newspaper and know that there were two different views.
And I think that the pressure on everybody, adults, more particularly children who are just developing their critical thinking skills, to be critical thinkers and be critical consumers in this current market is much more challenging than it ever has been before, which is why we need trustworthy news sources such as the ABC and the Sydney Morning Herald, which, you know, take the fact that they need to earn that trust from their readers and their viewers very seriously. And this is where, you know, discernment and parental guidance helps. But again, you know, if you have adults who aren't particularly literate, who don't really understand the spectrum, then the kids are going to be in strife.
Absolutely.
Catherine, you look like you want to jump in.
Oh, yes. My grandfather was a journalist with the Sydney Morning Herald. So, you know, and at that time there was no byline. It was just straight reporting. And I think that people felt that they didn't even then probably didn't appreciate that there might have been an opinion, but it was fairly much more factual. Whereas I think you're right now, Jordan, because there's always a byline, it can be more of an opinion. But I'm interested in how do children discern and develop critical thinking if they're only getting their news from TikTok or social media. So my 4 big grandchildren, who are 24 to 18, would all be getting their information either from the television, which is probably one of the commercial stations, dare I say it, and social media, and from hearing what their parents said. But I love the stories that the Kennedys used to talk about years ago when they would sit at the dinner table and old Joe Kennedy would insist that every child, all 7 or 8 or however many of them, 12 of them there, but they all talk about the current affairs of the day. And it's those families, I think, around the dinner table at night. Not everybody eats that way, and I wish they did, but it's that parents being able to say, let's talk about the issues of the day, and every child start to learn how to articulate their opinion, which I think leads to critical thinking. And of course I could never give up the Sydney Morning Herald because I have to do the cryptic every day.
Paulina, I wonder what your view is of the changing face of media, social media, and the impact that that's having as well, because clearly accessibility has really shifted, and particularly over the last couple of years at a really rapid pace. Is that changing how young people at your school are talking about news in the world around them?
Oh, I think children today are much more aware of what's happening in the world than when I was growing up. I think the news is at them and in their face. They know what's happening in the Middle East. They do know what's happening with climate change. They know about those social issues. That they're very well informed. And I think social media has done that. It has brought it to them in a way that, you know, they may not have sat down and watched the 6 o'clock news with mum and dad, but they are seeing something on TikTok or whatever it is. But I think that we have a responsibility at school to have those conversations and to look at, you know, a grab on social media and, you know, this is clickbait. What does that mean? And how does that work? And how does that drag you in? And if you look at the story, does it really even refer to what was in the clickbait? And how do we know it's truth? And how do we test our sources? So now more than ever, there's information everywhere. So our skill is about how do you synthesise it? How do you discern? How do you test? So that's a whole different way.
So you actually lean into what they're seeing and what they're presenting or talking about and say, well, let's actually do some critical analysis
Absolutely.
of this.
I know I'm an English teacher for 30 years, so I feel like we've always done that. But clearly with social media, that's a whole different ballgame.
It just speeds up, I guess, doesn't it?
But certainly we do it in our pastoral care and wellbeing classes where we unpack things. I do it on assembly. I'll talk about the news reports and what's happening and the different sides to the whole school. So we find different ways to do it, and then it's within the curriculum and technology or different subject areas as well.
Catherine, I saw you nodding away.
Yes.
On that question around social media and the way you engage, because it's a reality, isn't it? It's not going anywhere.
And you can't run away from it.
Yeah.
And I noticed the schools, the Premier has now banned the mobile phones in schools, and I'm sure, Paulina, at your school that the students don't have their mobile phones. But I think the thing that I think is really keen is what you're doing, which is actually getting the kids to use the modern media and then have a conversation about how you translate that in your mind. So ChatGPT, it's the same thing. It's don't ban that. Get them to use it and understand that all it is the algorithms that sit behind it that make those facts appear to be truthful when in fact they're not. So in some cases, they're not always that truthful. So I think for students, it's really important for them to test and be out front, and as your school's clearly doing that, Pauline, is leading the girls on that whole path of critical thinking. If we don't give our students critical thinking, then we have failed them.
Jordan, you were talking about that your home might be a unique circumstance because of the job that you do and the way that you're thinking about education. That survey said that the most trusted source for kids in that survey was parents. How does that responsibility sit with us as a community?
Well, news habits, it's no secret to anyone, are changing significantly. You know, the under 40s are not consuming traditional media in the same way that we did and we do. So then there's the question of, well, you know, what are trusted sources? How do you communicate complicated concepts? Like, how do you tell the history of the Middle Eastern conflict on a TikTok video? Where are these videos coming from? And also much shorter attention spans.
Absolutely.
Like these are complex things.
Yep.
Now, I remember when I read Dolly when I was 14, there would be 1,500 word stories. And then about 10 years ago, I looked again and there were like 140 character bites. And now the magazine doesn't even exist anymore. So communicating complicated, nuanced concepts in these particular formats is going to be challenging. You know, it's the $1 million question about how traditional media harnesses this.
Sandy, I think we've got you back. We're having some tech problems. My apologies. You've got grandkids, and I know that you're really mindful about what they might be picking up from the news and how they're digesting and interacting with that. So how do you balance that challenging point about what you expose the kids to in the real world without stressing them out or doing harm or damage?
Yeah, and I think that, you know, when you look at anything that's on TV at the moment, it would stress anyone out, regardless of what age you're at. And I'll be honest, they're like 2, 5 and 8. So there's no way that I, at this point, especially with what's happening in the world, want them exposed to anything when it comes to the news. I think what is also disturbing is, you know, social media, and they are on, you know, they have their phone. They're not really on social media, although Florence does have a little page that she messages me on. But, you know, when I look at what is on social media, whether it is TikTok, whether it is, whether it's Facebook or whether it's Instagram, there are concerns about, just how authentic is that news. And, it can really do a lot of damage, I think, and create a lot of confusion as well. At the moment, because mine are only toddlers, I tend to protect them, I guess, from the news. They're homeschooled, which I've mentioned before. And so they are tending to look at more life skills, versus, I guess, current news. Their focus is more about creativity and, where do potatoes come from and how to dig them up, that type of thing. They're not really exposed to the news, and I'm quite happy about that for the moment. When the time comes, though, I hope that they'll come to me, they'll come to their parents for a greater explanation. I really enjoyed the little kids before, though, talking about how, they'd like to see more positive news. That would be great. But one of them said that they'd like, a program that explained it. And I thought that was really a great comment. Explained it in their language and simplified it, because it is complex. And when we look at what's happening in the world at the moment, it is very confusing. And they're all different sides and all different stories, and, what is truth and what is not. So, but I do worry about social media for sure when it comes to anything. I Google. If I want to know something, I go to Google. I watch the ABC. There's a plug. But I actually Google long before I'll go to social media.
It's an interesting point about that explainer piece, because this year, talking a lot about the voice to all different audiences, I worked with the ABC Kids team to do a podcast about, well, what is the voice for a younger audience? And so I kind of bashed out a script and went, all right, it's this. And they came back to me and went, right, we've got to go back to basics, and it's about the words you're using. When you say constitution, we need to explain what that means. And when I listened back to it afterwards, I was like, wow, this is so straightforward. It was fascinating. So maybe there's a universal truth in the explainers there. We're going to have to move on to the perennial question of how much is too much discipline at school. It's an increasingly important conversation, with Australian classrooms among the most disorderly in the world, and there's little sign things are changing. The most recent OECD survey of 15-year-olds found Australia ranked 8th last out of 75 countries when it comes to classroom noise and disruption dragging down academic performance. Analysts say there's a myriad of factors driving that poor behaviour, from the lingering effects of COVID-19, technology distraction and a lack of support for kids with anxiety, autism and ADHD. In Britain, classroom reforms have improved behaviour and test scores, led since 2015 by a bureaucrat Fleet Street has dubbed the Behaviour Czar, who is with us now. Tom Bennett is the lead behaviour advisor to the UK's Department of Education and joins us now from London. Thanks for your company.
My pleasure, Dan. Good to be here.
You were a teacher before becoming a researcher into education systems. What were you seeing in classrooms that you thought they needed work and needed to be transformed?
Well, as soon as you start teaching, you realise that you haven't actually been trained to manage behaviour at all. And you think it's just yourself until you realise it's almost everybody else you know as well. And this was, I thought, a UK problem, but the more countries are visited, the more I realised that this was actually an international problem and that no country's got it right. So there's a real deficit in helping teachers understand how to manage other people's behaviour. I mean, you can barely manage your own behaviour. You have to be trained to deal with other children's behaviour, particularly groups of children, and particularly groups of children, including children with lots of challenges and difficulties in their lives. So that was one of the main things. Another thing we saw, particularly in the UK, but again, very obvious abroad, is that there's a really kind of crazy modern conception that children naturally want to behave and that we just have to plan really good lessons. The idea that, for instance, that behaviour, when it's misbehaviour, it only comes from, for example, some kind of mental distress and so on. And that's just not true, because, kids are kids, and I'm reliably informed that means they're people, which means that we make mistakes and we do good things and we do bad things. And one of the main things we need to do in education is to teach teachers how to teach children the behaviour that will help them to flourish and be successful at school. So there's a whole mess of things going on there, which creates a kind of perfect storm. Australia is not alone in this problem. Like I say, no country has got this right yet.
Tom, what did you find about the link between behaviour, order in the classroom, and then academic performance and those outcomes?
Oh, it's absolutely beyond question. If children aren't behaving, everything we want to achieve for them in a classroom, safety, dignity, critical thinking, creativity, knowledge, all the perennials, none of this is possible in classrooms that are chaotic. And you get a lot of people who think, oh, I don't mind if my classroom is kind of, wacky and really noisy all the time. Noise is fine, but it's got to be purposeful noise. And if children aren't behaving, then they're not safe. They can't exist in dignity, they can't listen, they can't learn, and so on. So the connection between good behaviour and everything we want to achieve is enormous. And that's one of the things we try to focus on, the idea that nobody flourishes in chaos, especially children from disadvantaged circumstances. But that's a rising tide that lifts all ships, and all children deserve a classroom which is calm, which is safe, and which is dignified.
Paulina, you run a pretty big school. How much of your time is spent dealing and navigating behaviour challenges or issues?
A little bit, but not a lot. We're very lucky. Behaviour is not a really massive issue in my school. Having said that, I've been in many different schools over years where it has been. And I think that when we're looking at behaviour, we need to understand some is behaviour that is bad behaviour because you've been traumatised all your life. You've lived in a cycle of neglect or abuse or violence, and you respond accordingly, and you have to relearn how to behave in society. Some children have ADHD, genuinely cannot concentrate, have no impulse control. And I think some children are probably the product of parents of my era, where it was all about praise and self-esteem. And I think we may have overparented, and we now have some spoilt and naughty children who feel very entitled. And so that's the behaviour that I find very difficult to tolerate, but still behaviour that needs to be checked and changed. I think what you're saying is absolutely right, that we need calm, no chaos. We need order, we need expectations, a whole lot of love. I've never been able to teach in a chaotic classroom. I just can't imagine. And very, very high expectations. So at my school, when I talk about respect and what that means, I will be very explicit at assembly and say, respect means we look at each other in the face when we walk past each other and say hello. Respect means when your teachers are in front of you, you don't talk when they're speaking. I feel today we need to be much more explicit about what respect looks like. I don't think children are able to self-regulate. I think delayed gratification in this era of everything now and fast and quick is a problem. And so teaching children to self-regulate, we spend a lot of time on that at school. And I just think that it's not a one-size-fits-all. And we have to approach every child differently. But I do think that parents these days can enable some of the bad behaviours, and that's kind of new to me, where the parent will, if the child's done something quite shocking and you have consequences in place, and that parent will come in and want to argue with you about why those consequences don't work, or they'll bring their lawyer. So, you're working in a very different world there where how dare you question...
Hold on, they actually bring lawyers?
Oh, absolutely. If you go to discipline children or suspend or expel, it wouldn't be uncomfortable. It wouldn't be that uncommon for some parents to say, there's a veiled threat there. I'll discuss this with my lawyers and come back to you.
Well, that would be chilling.
It is, but it is the world we work in, and it's why our principals are probably leaving in droves. So you have the behavioural issues in class, but then you have parents you have to educate as well.
Catherine, I saw you nodding away, particularly around the complexity then of the role and responsibility of parents, and how then schools and the education systems interact there.
Look, it's twofold, and it depends, it's probably multifold. It depends a lot on the school, but I know in a lot of schools they've actually designed to have, particularly in schools where the community may be coming from the poorer ends of the community, and they have a contract with the parents. One wonderful principal of a junior school, primary school, who, if roll call was every morning at 9 a.m, and if Johnny or Sally wasn't there, she was on the phone to the parent. If the parent didn't answer, she got in the car and she went round and she said, Mrs. Johnny, Johnny's coming to school with me today. Oh, I couldn't get out of bed this morning. I was too tired to bring Johnny to school. Johnny's coming to school with me in the car. And she made Johnny, it only took a year. And all the parents then sent the children to the school. So the contract between the principal and the parent can be as light touch as that, or actually sitting down with the parents and saying, here's the contract, the child signs the contract, the parent signs the contract, and the principal signs the contract. And the contract is about, as Paulina was saying, respect, recognising the authority of the school and recognising that you're there to learn. And I was really pleased, Tom, to hear you talk about the fact that kids really need order. They, you know, living in chaos is only in fiction, and that's fantasy land. Kids really need order, and they really need it when they often come from a very disorderly family background, as Paulina was articulating. It's not hard. But the other point that I think, Tom, we haven't quite hit on, and I think, Paulina, you would give your new graduate teachers a lot of support, but teachers don't get good groundings of working with children with difficult behaviours in teachers at universities. And we don't have an automatic mechanism of support for new graduates to give them the opportunities to learn how to deal with very confronting behaviours. And there are many ways of disarming children in that way, of their complex behaviours. And I think that's one of the areas that we need to really focus on.
Well, Tom, is that something that you've looked into? And I wonder if you also want to go to what is actually working? What have you seen is best practice in your studies?
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of what is best practice is actually something that will resonate a lot with many parents and many people who've been teaching for a long time, which is this. When children enter the classroom environment, this is new to them. They need a lot of patient and explicit instruction about the behaviours and habits that they need in order to thrive in an institutional environment. Kids aren't born with this. And what you find is that children from the lower end of the socio-economic spectrum tend to suffer the most in these sexual environments, because often that correlates strongly with, you know, a lack of socialisation into these institutions. And so what we need is to teach children the routines and habits to flourish. Then what we need is that teachers need to be taught how to teach that, which is a bit meta. And then we need to make sure that teachers are allowed to use systems which are relatively straightforward and simple in the classroom. Because when you're teaching trigonometry or history or something, you do not have time to be the individual therapist for one child out of 25 or one child out of 30, which doesn't mean we don't care about children who've got additional needs. What it means is, if we do care about them, that any work like that, which is more pastoral based, has to be done outside of the classroom. But the teachers need to have a really clear behaviour policy to follow, and that comes from leaders. That, you know, they can't invent that by themselves. And then the leaders need to uphold that throughout the school, and those boundaries need to be maintained not only with pastoral support, but also with really simple, straightforward, escalatory, you know, sometimes sanction-based tariffs, but other forms of consequences too. We need to get rid of this idea that all misbehaviour can be tackled just with a nice chat at the end of the day. That for some children, perhaps a minority, they need to know that they could get in trouble, that they're going to get reprimanded for something, not because we like reprimanding them, but because we want them to avoid the reprimand. So it becomes a deterrence. And it's very similar to like driving on the road, for example. You know, you need to have really clear rules that everyone understands, which are transparent, but everyone knows. And then you can hold them to account for those rules. And if somebody struggles with those rules, then we have a response for it. And those responses are often quite simple. But kids cannot do as they please in a classroom, in the same way that drivers cannot run a red light. You know, there have to be boundaries and consequences. And I think there's been a big shift in education over the past 40 years, that we somehow assume that we should never, you know, tell a child off or reprimand them or issue a sanction. You know, this is crazy. This is how things fall apart. You know, classrooms are not the land of do as you please. And they're not the purge either. What we need are classrooms to understand that there are rules and conventions and etiquette so that everybody can flourish.
Jordan, I know you've been reporting a lot on this in your former role before you took on this chief reporting role, and you've been looking at where the efforts are focused. New South Wales appointed a chief behaviour advisor earlier this year. The government is increasing behavioural specialists in the system to, I think it's around 200. So where's the work being targeted, and what's your observation of that?
Oh, look, I think those things are barely touching the slide. It was the last government that appointed, effectively trying to attempt a version of Tom in New South Wales.
The Australian Education
Staff.
Staff.
Yes, but you know, the last government, New South Wales government, appointed that, and it's sort of fizzled out a little bit under this one. And 200 behaviour specialists. Look, you know, it's a great start, but the exact qualification of these behaviour specialists is a bit unclear. It just seems like people who've been in the classroom for a while, tick that box, you must be a behaviour specialist. There is a huge, and I appreciate what Catherine was saying before about how this fantastic principal went and got those kids and brought them. Most public schools in Australia and in New South Wales do not have the resources to do that sort of stuff. They also, if they have a contract with a student, they can't get rid of that student. Public schools have an obligation, a legal obligation, to teach every child in their catchment. And it's very, very, very difficult to expel a student, extremely difficult in the public system. There is a huge issue with resourcing. So teachers are employed to teach, but at the moment teachers are health workers, they're psychologists, they're social workers. They're dealing with kids who've got serious domestic violence at their places, who've got very, very complex needs. They have extremely little background, if any, in handling children with disabilities. A lot of them, we're talking about teacher training, and teacher training is being addressed in Australia, but that's only for the teachers who are graduating university. We have 100,000 teachers already in the system who weren't trained in this. So there is, what Tom is talking about, this explicit instruction in behaviour, that's actually kind of a low-cost way of doing this. Once teachers are trained in how to do this, they can roll this out at schools. But it's things like how to support kids with extremely complex needs, how to train teachers up in this, how to get the kind of health system support into schools that you need. Until this is really addressed, I think there is always going to be a problem, particularly in public schools, with behaviour. We have situations in which kids who've got sort of autism with a particular kind of violent diagnoses cannot get a place in a support class. There just aren't enough. So I think there's a real need to strip this down and look at exactly how we can resource these schools. And it probably shouldn't be the Department of Education that's paying for it. A lot of this is communities and justice stuff, it's health stuff. There needs to be a lot more collaboration so that the teachers aren't left with doing the job of 5 other highly qualified professionals as well.
Yeah, Sandy, and I understand you were having a conversation on this very topic just today about a classroom. What did you discover? Or what did you hear, rather?
Actually, I did have one of our clients mention that a student was put on detention and the parent asked if they could do it for them, which was really interesting. But look, I grew up in Catholic school, and that meant that the strap came out daily for no reason whatsoever. So if the nun actually went away for an hour, she came back, and you just got belted. But I actually thought I would just read something that I presented at a conference not long ago, and I will say, with what Tom is saying. I resonate with everything that he is saying. I think the one thing that someone spoke to me about, actually a few teachers, and that is the fact that there's a huge lack of respect for teachers and a lack of support for teachers. And that comes not just from the students, but it comes from the parents. But I did a presentation not long ago, and I just want to read this, if you don't mind. The young people of today think of nothing but themselves. They have no reverence for parents or old age. And I started this presentation with this, and it was, they are impatient of all restraint. They talk as if they know everything, and for what passes for wisdom with us is foolishness with them. And as for the girls, well, they're forward, immodest and unladylike in speech, behaviour and dress. Now, that was written by Peter the Hermit in AD 1274. And, you sort of think, well, the world has definitely changed, of course, since then. But when we go back to the very core of it, it's like children are children, young adults are young adults. And, they do need to have these boundaries and these expectations very clear in place, because we've never really changed. What Tom was talking about makes so much sense, in the fact that it's a bit like an induction for a new staff member. They don't know what they're meant to do, really, unless you're very explicit in explaining every detail. When it comes down to respect, well, I guess some people have different versions of that. And so I really like the idea that every teacher, I think every teacher does deserve more respect from the parents as well. because I hear what they're saying, the contract is between the parents, the student and the school. But what I do hear is that they do want and need more support. They sort of hit the ground running when they are a new teacher as well. They don't understand how to manage the culture of behaviour within their classroom. And so having something that is more formalised and supportive for them, I think would be really valuable for our systems.
Tom, what do you make of that? Is that part of what should be next steps, is having a rethink about how those relationships and those interactions actually happen?
We've got to remember, I completely agree with what was just said there. Relationships don't happen by magic. They're not some kind of fairy gift. Relationships are built by being trustworthy. That's how you build trust, which means being predictable. And we want good relationships between parents and students and staff, which means there has to be an agreed code of conduct between all three of these parties, which means transparency, which means clarity, which means making sure that everyone understands what the school's going to do, what the students need to do, and indeed what the parents can do to support the school and vice versa. Because, there's a big value overlap here. But the school and the parents both want the best for the child. 99% of parents do, certainly anyway. A very small percentage are, have toxic relationships. And so what we need to do is to make clear what the behavioural and conduct expectations are, teach them, reinforce them over and over again, and make sure teachers are supported in doing so. Because a lot of teachers will find that when they try to enforce the school behaviour policy, they'll be undermined by people superior to them because they feel like they want to be the nice, person. And so they need to know themselves what the conduct expectation is for them. But when you have clarity of expectations between all of these parties, that's when you have a healthy relationship, not a bad relationship or a toxic one, but a healthy one. And it's something we need to be focusing on a lot more. And it starts with, as you say, teacher training and leadership training, and then making sure that teachers and leaders are supported in this. And when specialist provision is required, that can be done by specialist partners from third parties. But there's a lot of investment that's needed in that too.
Yeah, Tom, we've got about a minute left. I want to give you the last word. I'll only jump in to stop us from falling off the air. What's the low-hanging fruit?
Yeah. The low-hanging fruit, oh God, I've kind of mentioned it, which teach teachers how to teach behaviour, which you make sure routines and norms are understood, and you make sure there are clear and simple procedures for schools, and you get rid of all these crazy ideas that all misbehaviour somehow stems from a mental health problem or trauma or something along those lines. There's a reason why traffic wardens don't hand out restorative justice discussion tickets. They hand out parking tickets. I mean, a blend of consequences, sanctions, and so on to make all that happen.
Yeah, no justice discussion tickets. That is all we have time for. Thank you so much to our guest, Tom Bennett. Great to have you along. And also to the incredible panel,
Pleasure.
Paulina Sherman, Jordan Baker, Catherine Groner and Sandy Chong. Do have an excellent weekend. Julia Baird will be back with you in the hot seat on Monday. For now, though, good night.